Alex, welcome to the PLA podcast. I am really excited to dive in today, not only because you've had this incredible HR career that I think so many of our listeners would be envious to be able to have any parts of it, but also because you're at this really fascinating AI forward company called Clay that is doing things I think many people would think a bit differently than how they get done on average in so many different respects of the function. I will give a quick intro on your background because it is so awesome. And then I'd love for you to share a little bit more with our audience from your lens about how you've thought about your own journey in this profession. But what makes you so interesting? One of the first things is that you spent nearly a decade at Google during the heyday when Laszlo Bach was like redefining what people function was, that we weren't just HR, we weren't this administrative passive reactive type of function, but something that was really proactive, forward thinking, that wove in different parts of not only classic, amazing HR, but paired it with things that were more consulting esque and research esque. And you got to have a front row seat on that bus during that amazing time. You then went on to Flatiron Health as their people leader through hypergrowth and through its acquisition, and then got to lead your first AI forward company, people at Jasper. And now you're at Clay, which is your second AI forward company that you're leading people with. And that was part of why I was so attracted to having you come on and share your experience. Because right now, so many people are like, wait, what? AI? Like they're catching up. And you've already been sitting in this at two companies that are really at the cutting edge of what this transformation, this evolution, this, I don't know, leap forward of technology is happening for us. Thank you for joining us and would love if you could share a bit more with our audience about how you look at your career.
Maybe the trick is that I don't look at my career very much. I mostly look at the companies. You said I had a front row seat at Google in its heyday. I feel like I had this bird's eye view. I always say I had this bird's eye view of an industry and transformation. And like the biggest thing that I took away from that decade at Google was both the power of like the employee and the human centricity in shaping a company that would then shape an industry. And so I joined right before the Google phone came out, right when the iPhone was coming out, and we were all trying to figure out mobile. I worked on a lot of things in terms of like the ads transformation that was occurring at Google as we sort of thought what the internet would look like in this next generation, and then got to work on the cloud transformation as that was getting started. And so I've always just really gravitated towards like, what's the business problem that's really interesting? And how do I get a courtside seat at that problem? And so that's really been the through line for me and all the career decisions I've made is like, I want to build the most interesting, cool, fascinating company and business. And this is like my way to do it. This is my contribution and where I leverage my own skills in doing that. And I just like when I meet founders now, or when I was making the evaluation about Clay, it's just like, what problems are you solving? Why are you getting stuck? What do you need from a business standpoint? Because the answer is almost always people, as we know. And so then it's like my superpower to get to translate that.
When you were talking to the Clay founders, at this point, you've been ahead of people a few times over. You probably had a lot of companies who were knocking on your door saying, hey, come, come, come. We're amazing. We're the next big thing. What was it about Clay's founders and what they were saying that stood out to you?
I don't think since I started at Google, like right in 2008, had I met founders that believed so intrinsically that the people that you hire shape the future of the business until I met Varun and Kareem. It is the most people first environment that I have seen in the intervening like 18 years. And I think what I saw in them was that they really believed that you find the most interesting, unique, creative, spiky people out there and you let them sort of discover the value that they can add to a business and shape their own roles. And there's this sort of virtuous loop, I think, that occurs when you allow people to actually find out what they're really good at and how they can use that to move the company forward. And then they like do the best work of their lives. And then other people see that and they want to join on and they feel inspired to sort of level up and take on that next path. I hadn't really seen that human centricity. And I think, especially right now, and, I've spent the last 3, 4 years in like this AI centered space. So much of the narrative has shifted away from the idea that humans have unique strengths that we could be leveraging. And so to meet founders who are basically like, here's this important cultural principle that we built the entire company around, and we need the steward for like the next phase of that because we want to be able to grow and scale and tackle all of these next set of ambitions without losing sight of this ability to discover people's like unique capabilities and nurture them. And we want somebody who we entrust to create the conditions where people can do the best work. I was like, oh yeah, okay, sign me up. That's such a fun puzzle to get to solve.
Alex, I love that you're calling out the distinctiveness of the cultures and the organizations that you're trying to build. And it sounds like that was the draw for you, where you want to build that innovative, creative, distinctive organization. We didn't prep you with this because I just saw the post a couple of days ago on LinkedIn. It was something about your CFO on video talking about being proud that you spent seven figures on your office holiday party. And I listened to it. I was like, oh my goodness, let's see what's going on here. And I think the essence of it was that we want to stand out. We want to be different. And it's worth spending money to be distinctive in this environment where there's continues to be such competition for talent. Could you, I assume you've seen it, I would love for you to expand on this idea of the value of being distinctive.
So at the premise, I feel like of Clay is how do we create the conditions where people can do the best work of their lives? And so then you ask yourself, what do those conditions look like? And where are the places where we are differentiated in those conditions? Because when you're attracting talent in particular, they're looking at you side by side and across a number of different factors. And they're basically saying, why this company and not the other companies? And we're in, I think, a very competitive talent market. And the candidates we're going after have their pick of companies that will all ideally probably do relatively well in the coming years. And so for a lot of people, the conditions and environment and culture are a huge part of their decision making, in addition to like who they think will win and where they think like the market leaders will go. And so for us, that condition has been a lot around the connections that we build as employees and the way that we actually build community and how that drives collaboration. And so for us, I think we play up and really intentionally try to tell the story externally about how we all win together, about how it's unique and rare to really prioritize and invest in the things that people want to build that connection. So to me, like the holiday party is like a sub example of this like broader investment that we've had and what the experience is of working here. When you're looking at like roles side by side, we hope that maybe that's the outlier. And that's the story that we want to tell of like, you should come here because you're excited about an environment and an experience that prioritizes this connection and collaboration and community.
This is so powerful, and I would love to continue to dig a little deeper on it. I was about to come with kind of a spicy take of like, why the holiday party? Why not raises? Why not growth and development? Maybe you're doing some of those things. In the People Leader Accelerator world, we talk about that as an EVP, an employment value proposition. Like, what's special about us? Why would you come here versus alternatives? Why would you stay here versus alternatives? And I heard you say that it's about human connection. And Alex, I wonder, is that a broader HR strategy in general that you've followed as a through line in your career? Or is this more closely connected to the specific product and services that Clay offers? And that human connection, if you're enabling marketing support, I've experimented with the Clay product myself for PLA. If that human connection is what you're trying to create between people selling services and people buying services, is this you trying to mirror that inside your organization? Help us understand where these connections come from.
So I'd say me as an individual, I think for anyone selecting a head of people role, like you've got to have some level of founder alignment, cultural alignment to do your best work. So for me and the conditions that help me do my best work, it's that level of like ability to mind meld and build a shared mental model so that we're starting from the same place, but then we can operate really autonomously. We're keeping that in mind. If this is a part of me, it absolutely is. It also predated me because it was there and it was part of what attracted me and what allowed me to feel like I can drive the outcomes that this company needs because I see that compatibility with how we're problem solving. I think within Clay, for folks who aren't familiar with the product, it's an orchestration layer for pretty much all the go-to-market functions. So marketing, sales, revenue operations, you're going to like really be able to build on Clay and use the Clay platform to drive growth in your business, to acquire new customers, to basically solve a set of challenges that you might have in trying to build a bigger business. When Clay was getting started, the way that Clay, I think, really took off as a product was through the community it fostered in terms of Clay users and evangelists and people who really loved and built their careers around the product. And I think that was really core to the DNA of the organization. That idea that like people get really excited and passionate about something and they want to share it with others and they want to bring more people in. And so I think that idea that we go farther together is very much true in like the product and the product success journey. I do think internal and external values have to feel really aligned. And when you're interviewing for people, leader jobs, people will sometimes ask you like, how do you build culture? Like, what's the 3 things you do? And for me, I guess it's always like using what's already there. Like it has to be authentic and feel real to people. And if you're making those decisions and how you build your product and you see those values reflected in your marketing, in your sales, then you've got some ingredients as a people leader. When I was at Flatiron Health and we did cancer research. And so it was like completely different. I had done ad technology. Now I'm doing cancer research. But the mission was to learn from the lives of every person who had cancer. And so learning was this huge core value of the product. And then it became a huge core value of the culture. And how do we invest in learning and how do we invest in talent development? So for me, I need that alignment for myself, but I also need that alignment internally and externally. And do people actually believe it? Culture is like the lowest common denominator of what you'll accept in a company. So if you don't really believe it, you will undermine it immediately. And if you can find the places where that compatibility already exists, all the better.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things that you're bringing up that I really love here. And one is just the tie back to the business and what Clay is doing as a start, because there's this other element of the tools that Clay is building has led to an entirely new job to exist in this market called the go-to-market engineer, GDM engineer, which I think is unique and it's a bit quirky and it like follows so much of, I think, the culture too, of the fact that like you not only created a job title, but you made it really popular. And now, like, almost every hot company has go-to-market engineers that they're hiring. And that is incredible to like create an entire set of jobs that didn't exist before around this product. And so I think the culture matching the business is really fascinating here. But I loved about a year ago, Varun posted about the operating principles that
Mhm.
Clay had. And it was done in a way that was so, it felt unique, even though some of it was based in things that felt very classic. But there were only 2 operating principles listed at the beginning of the document. And one was negative maintenance, and the other one's non attached action. And it stuck with me so much. And I'm going to ask you to explain them in a moment that I sent it to multiple clients, like, "These are things that are happening that you should think about and how it's, like, impacting your culture." But it was just such uniqueness because it was a new phrase for a behavior that sort of was needed to be explained in many workplaces, but it was packaged in a way that made you go, "Huh, let me think about that harder." But could you talk more about the operating principles that exist at Clay? What does it actually mean for these 2 phrases that I just said of negative maintenance and non-attached action? And then how do they show up in the workplace?
Cultures are really built in the image of their founders, and like the specificity and precision of what you put forward as operating principles has to really ring true. Negative maintenance, I think, is the idea that you leave things better than you found it. The inverse of high maintenance for many people is like being chill, being relaxed. But truly, the inverse of high maintenance is that you are quietly and continuously improving and creating the impact that you wish to see. And we're very, very impact driven culture and really almost like allergic to some of like the shiny things potentially that at other organizations get celebrated. And so Kareem wanted to figure out and Bruin wanted to figure out how to sort of shine a light on the work that is actually invisible in many places because you're just leaving things better than you found it. And the next person comes along and they just experience it as fixed. And that helps, I think, to set a little bit of a tone around what behavior we want to reinforce. The non-attached action is actually a fun, like kind of mashup, essentially, of our 2 founders. You met Bruin, and Bruin is this ball of energy, Energizer Bunny, larger than life character who is just pure idea generation and like very quickly, faster than anyone I know, can really synthesize problem state, all the available solutions. Let's try these 3 solutions. Which one of them do you want? Okay, let's do it. Why haven't you done it yet already? I've never worked with anyone who has as much like momentum, forward momentum always as he does. And Kareem is very much like a polar opposite in the sense that he's like the stillness to Varun's action. And he's the person who's very like, begin with the end in mind and like, we will figure out the rest of the way. I think he's actually very comfortable sitting with the complexity and the mess and almost like luxuriating in it until the right answer appears. And so when you pull those two together, you basically have this kind of yin and yang of somebody who's very comfortable, like sitting with it and holding like the complexity in his head, and somebody else who's always moving, moving, moving. And we decided that the best way to kind of bring that to life as a value and a principle for people was to encourage people to go through that cycle of movement and momentum and iteration, but without attachment to what answer it is, to just stay with that end in mind. And I think that's really hard to do, honestly. Like in a high growth startup environment, people are very quick to get like offended or upset when an idea that they have isn't the idea that works, or when somebody moves too quickly on something and cuts them out or doesn't give them the exact information that they need. And both of them, I think, have really pushed people to actively like rewire and reset. And I can tell you some of the like practices around how we do this, but really pushed people to rewire and reset this idea that like they're attached to their way of doing things or to the approach that they were thought that they were doing, and to allow themselves to go through this cycle of forward momentum with just openness of like, we'll get to the right answer. We'll begin with the end in mind. We'll sort of move quickly through the missteps and get past and get out of them quickly.
I love so much of how that is a more tangible version of have no ego or low ego and, have a growth mindset. It was so wonderful to read about it and hear you talking about it because it's like, oh, yes, this is exactly what we're trying to get so many people to do so that you can have less friction as you're working together.
I think the biggest thing I've learned or relearning about myself in this role is the value of specificity. It was like my first insight when I was working with Kareem and Varun, and I would like say something casually and they would correct, like I'd say like, oh, well, that's why a few people. And they'd say a few people or 2 people. And I'd be like, 2 people. Like I was just finding myself from a like specificity standpoint, editing and becoming more precise. But they understand the power of language and the power of word choice really well. And I feel like it's really up my game because it's a company of external processors and people want to like talk and brainstorm, but you have to bring that same specificity and that precision. And that really, I think, helps to target the behavior that you're expecting and make very clear and knowable and transparent to the other person, like what that concept means versus like the broad and reused vague statements, which I think everybody can see themselves in, but like nobody can actually land in the same place because they're all hearing what they want to hear.
Let's follow that thread because I think that you're mentioning, hey, non-attached action, negative maintenance. How do you teach people this? How do you bring that specificity into the day to day?
So we had this really interesting conversation when I was first joining, probably in like my first month of joining. I think it was like irking them that people were getting offended by certain things that were well intended, but like a person had an idea and then it got discarded after they'd spent some amount of time on it, or a person didn't get the right kind of chain of communication about something that was changing until they felt it was too late. We're having this conversation where everyone was sort of like, we really feel like people should be giving more benefit of the doubt, like assume positive intent. And we talked about like those are sometimes weaponized in other workplaces. Like assume positive intent actually means I'm going to make a bunch of mistakes and you have to be okay with it. But a lot of times in a lot of organizations, the follow through isn't there where the person's intent actually is positive. I was saying like, guys, I think it's kind of more rare than you appreciate because you've been steeped in play context. That when you're assuming positive intent, it's because the other person actually did have positive intent. And I believe that of them. Like every time that I've had the moment of like, why didn't you tell me that thing? Like I need my founders to tell me that thing. And it never happens again. And so I said to them, I was like, this is rare for me that like the giving benefit of the doubt is really backed up. And so we were unpacking like, what is that? How do you create that rewiring and catharsis moment sooner in people? In a year of hyper growth, we're going, more than doubling this year from a headcount standpoint. Like, how do you accelerate that realization? And we added a section to our onboarding curriculum called Starting Fresh at Clay, affectionately nicknamed the shredding and shedding, because what we ask people to do is write down a lot of the previously conceived notions that they have from work, or some of the challenges they may have had in prior roles, or the parts of their working experience that was not to their liking, which it's very interesting. We do this exercise, by the way, and people fill pages with like simple prompts. They're welcome to share it as a part of onboarding. Usually people will share like 2 to 3 sentences of the pages that they've written, but they do share. And then we put it through a paper shredder. Everyone goes up and they shred it. And now what we're working on is this art installation mural that will take the shreds of those paper and figure out how to repurpose them into like the next stage of openness and growth to the way the company does things. It's been so successful. People love it. I didn't know if people would participate in it. I didn't know if they would roll their eyes at it, but I really think it's this almost cathartic moment. Discard and shred their previously conceived notions, shed them and like create them. And then they come in with a more openness to, we do things differently. Try to come along on this journey with us with like the openest of minds and learn what it's like to actually experience it here at Clay before you bring that back again. I don't know if that's perfect for everyone else's culture, but I feel like it's a good reminder for us that in onboarding, you can set this tone in a really tangible way of what you want from people. And I never done an exercise like this. So I'm just like really pleasantly surprised by how well it's taken off.
Many organizations think about culture and think about mission, vision, values, and that's often kind of minimally a slide at onboarding, or maybe at a leadership meeting or an all hands, and it's a slide and it has probably too many things listed, and it's probably some commonly used terms and phrases. One of the things I think that you did that's really powerful is be distinctive, be novel, be specific. You could have said continuous improvement, start with the end in mind, and bias for action. And we've all heard that. Those are kind of consultanty, HRE phrases that would largely roll off my head anyway. But by being novel and being specific, that I think engenders more curiosity. And so with that curiosity, your team members are actually open to learning more and exploring it more. And you're spending some real time with a hands-on, tangible activity at onboarding where they're digging into like whatever you thought it was before, like shred that, shed it, and we'll build this together. I think it's so powerful. And Alex, I often find that organizations feel like they don't have the time to develop something specific to them. I'd love to understand like how long it took to get the basics in place for this. I'm sure that you're continuing to tweak it. And what was the investment of upfront development in this?
It was incredibly fast. Like we had this conversation,
You and the 2 founders.
like a few other leaders at this manager retreat that we were at, where we were like, how different is this place than everywhere we worked? And how do we accelerate people realizing that?
Yeah.
I think I said to my onboarding coordinator, I'd like to try to think about something that we could do in onboarding that relates to this. Honestly, my brain did the same thing because I wasn't fully rewired yet. I did the same thing where I was like, and I will get back to that when I have like many of these other things done. And a week later, it was on the onboarding calendar, starting fresh at Clay. And I was like, what are we doing? And she was like, oh, I just have this worksheet. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. So then that was happening. And I was like, how's it going? And she was like, oh, people are sharing, people are loving it. And then one of my talent team members onboarded. She was like, I was missing kind of this like moment of catharsis at the end where I just like took my paper and like, guess I'll go back to my desk. And she's like, I feel like she's more woo-woo, I suppose you say. He was like, I feel like I wanted to like rip it up. So I was like, oh, okay, you should tell our onboarding coordinator that. And the next cycle, it had a shredder in it. And then our brand team got wind of it and they were like, we're going to paint a mural because we just like love this concept. And I was like, okay. And then 2 weeks later, somebody else joined and was like, hey, do you think we could do something with the paper scraps and maybe compost them into dirt and grow things in it? And then we came back and we were like, yeah, that one we definitely don't have time for, but it's a great idea. Maybe we can do something else with the paper scraps. Like maybe we can build them and create them like into flowers or like shape them into something. So it's this small iterative, like each person took a piece of it, ran with it probably before it was fully baked and ready. But like, what's the harm if the first 2 onboarding classes that did it didn't actually shred their papers? Like, who cares? We got moving, we got going, and then we had other people's eyes on the problem in a way we wouldn't have if we'd waited until we as a people team were like 100% ready.
Oh, so powerful. And you started from a place of confidence in that your co-founders had the core of it and owned it. And you're able to move faster because they were willing to articulate their vision and their expectations.
I think if you don't have values and beliefs that they really believe in, then they aren't your values. I mean, I honestly think that's where most values exercises fail.
100%.
It's the intellectual integrity and honesty to be like, I'm not going to put anything out there that they don't agree with. And if they don't agree with things, or they wouldn't do things the way I do, it almost doesn't matter. Like at some point, it is their company. Culture is like a rolling average of the last 90 days of behavior and decisions. So at some point, you're going to undermine whatever you put out there if whatever you put out there isn't intellectually honest with the way that things are actually happening. So that's like that mind meld for me is like, you
Yeah.
better really understand them and only put things out there that they will then quietly or actively reinforce.
Spicy professional opinion aligns very closely with this. So you don't have to fully agree with it, but culture starts at the top. You said that, it sprung from the founders. If those in power who make decisions, who hire, fire, promote, recognize, reward, et cetera, aren't fully aligned, and if it doesn't fully represent how decisions are really made, then it gets massively diluted and it doesn't really mean anything. A line on this is you can't crowdsource culture. You can't ask 1,000 people at 4 different levels, who do we want to be? Power is centralized typically in a smaller group. And so what you need to do is be able to articulate how that smaller group expects things to work. Yeah, taking ownership at the top made this work.
Is that spicy? I didn't even know that was spicy, Andrew, because to me, that is like the core of what we need
Love
to be
it.
honest with ourselves about people as people leaders is like we are enablement functions to create an environment. Like we can't be a solo architect or like individual practitioner that can just push it all out if we don't have that real clear direction.
The
Yeah.
one edit I would make to what Andrew said, though, is when you said the phrase, we can't crowdsource culture, I was like, I think you can't crowdsource the values or the operating principles that are the seed of culture, but I actually think culture is crowdsourced. Like your example is almost a perfect example of you didn't come up with the idea for this exercise, you gave it to someone else, and someone else kind of grew the next iteration of it, and the iterations of it in a way were crowdsourced because that was coming from others.
So I guess the way I've seen it is if you only ever talk to a subset of your population, then you don't actually have a true mirror of the organization, whether it's formal or informal. The crowdsourcing is actually about holding the mirror up to the organization you're in and looking at all the crevices of how people are actually experiencing the day to day. So if you're running a focus group on values, you'd ask them like, well, what do you say about the company at a party? Like if somebody asks you about the company, you want to know that. You want to know the lived reality of individuals. But I think the aspiration, the who do we want to be and what are we willing to commit to, that is the tops down moment for me. Like that can't actually
Right.
bottoms up. There has to be a commitment and a consistency to what we want to be as an organization that sets the tone for where we're going.
I love that you pulled out that nuance because that's exactly in line with the way that Andrew and I have thought about this in the past.
I feel like that's where good intentions often go awry. Good intentions by senior leaders and HR leaders and wanting to involve everyone and wanting to understand what everybody wants and how do you want this place to be. And often a leader will try to delegate, I'm not sure what we want to be. Why don't we ask all the people what we want to be? But all the people are experiencing this kind of diluted like lack of clarity unless you provide it from the top. My opinion is you can't ask everybody what you want to be. You have to start with clarity from the top on what you want to be, and then ask everybody how you're experiencing so that you can get it dialed in.
I would say my empathy is that I think when you don't have leaders that are engaged and passionate about these topics, a lot of times a head of people will think to themselves, how do I even do this at all if I'm not getting the airtime and the headspace? And like we all have some amount of like control we can in us. And so we think to ourselves, like, these are the things I can control. Like I can spin up these work streams and conversations and bring together these observations. And that's my way to actually think about getting this focus and attention. And that's where I would say, like, you're sort of like a cultural archaeologist in a job like ours, or maybe a journalist because it's in real time. Like, I would actually sit with the organization and watch it in action and figure out what those behaviors and practices are that you've already committed to doing, and figure out how you tell that story with specificity to people versus thinking that like you can kind of create the outcome that you want. If you're not getting it verbally given to you, you can still look at it and watch it in action and figure out how you create that specificity of language around what's happening.
It would be so interesting to hear about how you're seeing things at Clay right now, because it is a moment of growth. And I think scale is often at times where the idea of how do we create a culture that is strong, that doesn't dilute over time, that doesn't dilute with more people. What's on your mind as you're thinking about culture in 2026 and beyond at Clay, where you're putting your focus and attention?
So I'm probably really lucky in this sense because I don't feel like anybody gave me the mandate of like preserve and like hold tight, hold fast to this culture as we grow and scale. I feel like everyone had the mindset of what does culture look like at 300, 500, 1,000? Like, how do we allow ourselves to evolve and grow like a living organism into like these next chapters? Maybe not everybody gets that luxury. But for me, I feel like what that enabled me to do was say what makes sense for each one of these stages of growth and to not feel so scared to propose new or different things or challenge previously existing notions of how we did things. When I was interviewing, I remember asking Kareem and Varun, I think it's really hard to time things properly. You kind of always do things too early or too late. Are you hiring me to anticipate what is coming and like get ahead of things? Or are you hiring me like basically to address and fix a bunch of things? And we had that conversation, and both of them, like their first response was like, oh, do everything too late. If the problems haven't occurred, why would you know what you're fixing? Like, how much should you be like anticipating? You don't know what the things are that are going to go wrong. When you're like a 3-time people leader, everybody is hiring you to anticipate and like tell them what's going to break. You can't even help it. You do it instinctively. But to have like the empowerment of actually, you should wait to see what breaks so you know specifically and precisely how to fix it and what to fix. To just have that as an empowerment was really beautiful for me. And I think it pertained to culture where I don't think everyone was anticipating like we're going to lose this and how do we preserve it and what do we keep it? Everyone was like, look at like this moment in time, look at what isn't working and fix that thing that isn't working and just keep doing that in each kind of growth moment and challenge. And part of that is that we don't want people to have this like FOMO moment of, oh, I wish I was here when the company was X and everything was so great. And then over time, we watered that down and flattened that because we were just trying to only do the things that we could scale and maintain. It's like each moment, each chapter in Clay's history is going to feel different and unique and specific to the problems and the moment that we're in. This will be hypergrowth year. Next year probably won't be hypergrowth year. Maybe it will be, but some amount of the foundation will have been set in a very different way. And that chapter will just look different. And so don't build for necessarily next year, like stay focused on some of the challenges of this year.
We talked a bit about Clay is a very cutting edge AI forward place. It is your second AI company that you've been at. From your viewpoint, what is different about being in an AI company versus any other?
Well, I think that a lot of what I'm describing around speed and iteration are just much more inherent in the pace and the culture of organizations that are building around a technology that is changing and growing so quickly. I had a hypergrowth experience when I was at Flatiron Health, but we were in a critical to get right space of cancer research. And so the value sometimes was on making sure we felt that level of conviction in what we were putting forward. And those are the sorts of things that permeate all parts of a company, right? So people want to get things right. They want to really exhaustively like debate and discuss and make sure we've considered all of the angles of things so that we're putting forward something we feel really proud of and bringing together like the right set of cross-functional disciplines into creating something that is durable. All these people coming from like medical backgrounds where like the implication of making mistakes is very different than those of us in the tech space. Whereas when you're in these spaces that's building around like foundational technology that's changing all the time, customers that are changing their own technology all the time, and you're in this sort of No one has the right answer. We need to keep iterating and learning and tracking what's working and growing from there. That's kind of the metronome that sets the pace of the organization. And so everybody is very comfortable with that level of pace and change in a way that just felt very different. Even if we were incredibly hardworking and incredibly focused and disciplined in prior roles, our central nervous system wasn't used to the frenetic energy that I've seen over the last kind of 3 years. Sometimes people will say like, oh, you're at an AI company. Like, I'm not at an AI company. How do I bring AI into my organization? And it's almost something I hate talking about now that I've done it twice. Because I'm like, but my organizations are wired so differently. They're built with that as like the starting foundation of how they operate versus having to do the behavioral change and the change management of rewiring an organization. Like, you have to figure out what the discarding and rewiring is that you need to do in your organization. Because at mine, a company of employees who've largely grown up with a lot of this technology.
It sounds like hiring is different because you are looking for these core characteristics for when people come in the door. They come with them as opposed to we need to change these people who have already been here with it.
We usually look at like, what will people teach us? What's some different way that they think about the world? That's a huge part of being kind of people first instead of role first, is we're not really working backwards from like a checklist of like, here's what the role is. Can the person do it? I think a lot of the comfort with new technology and ability to adopt new ways of working and ability to change your own workflows or investigate how you can do your own job differently, that like stems from these cultural competencies around like, are you learning new things? Are you teaching us new things? Are you curious? Are you willing to try things differently? So for us, we get it like the same competencies, but we're not like testing like, what's the last thing you built on AI? In some roles, we do that where that's really critical from a competency standpoint. But in most roles, we're just trying to understand people's curiosity and learning and like excitement in the world about any topic. And then we assume it will translate to technology as well.
Really appreciate you being willing to go deep on culture at Clay. And I think that'll be tremendously interesting to our audience. We do have a few core questions that we ask every guest. We call these the accelerator round questions. And the first is, PLA loves high leverage learning. If you could recommend just 2 resources, a person, a book, a blog, to an emerging people leader, what 2 sources would make your cut?
Wes Cow writes a communications
Oh,
newsletter. I send that to everybody in any role, not just people leader role. I think communication is like the foundation of how you work most successfully in an organization. I'm also always a big fan of Molly Graham's Substack as well. And I think she is somebody who is able to take the language that the rest of us are steeped in and sort of like rewire us and help us build the language that the rest of the world needs to hear our concepts.
Great recommendations. What one sentence of advice could you share about how to accelerate a successful HR career today?
Best advice anyone ever gave to me was don't be a decorative plant. I grew up in an HRBP role, and for a while I thought I was just like soaking in context and like puzzle pieces together. And that's why I was in meetings and conversations. And then a person on my team actually was like, you're like a decorative plant in that meeting. You have to contribute something. You have to bring something. You have to be a part of that cycle, or there's no reason to have you in the room just for decoration. In meetings, it's still like a question I ask myself if I think I'm not participating in the right way.
That is so good. All right. Who would you recommend that we speak with on the podcast in the future?
You guys talk to Carolyn Cooley. She's somebody who's always been sort of like an inspiration and a mentor of mine. She's just wrapping up at FanDuel, but she's been in a bunch of different organizations and probably more so than anyone I know feels like she holds a center of gravity as a people leader around practices. She taught me how to do like no negotiation comp and things like that in a way that I just think is really effective.
Before we wrap, how can listeners best connect with you?
LinkedIn, probably, with some appreciation for the fact that I have 2 young kids and a crazy job. And so I'm just a little bit slow at responding to things.
Alex, this has been so wonderful. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for the depth and specificity along the way.
Thank you both.